Thank you.
Jindiwala, everybody. Hello. Did anybody else want to say something just at the very start, or are we happy for me to just jump in? No? Okay, beautiful. Jindiwala, I hope everybody who is watching this is in the right place. First Nations Negotiation of Nonfiction panel. It is very beautiful to have so many people gathered here from so many different places across the world. The land that I am speaking to you from today is the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation. I'm a guest on this country. I'm very lucky to be living here and to be safe under their custodianship and ongoing continuing sovereignty and care for their country. So I would like to pay my respect and my honour to that custodianship, to that continued sovereignty, and also to extend my respect and honour to the many places from which people are speaking to us today. I'm assuming that it's all Indigenous land, unless we've got a couple of people who are reaching us from outer space or anything like that. Not sure about that, but, you know, the internet is a wonderful and powerful thing. So paying respect to that sovereignty and to that custodianship as well. I always personally love it to get a little bit of a shout out of whose land you're speaking from in the chat. If people would be interested in popping that in, I think that could be a way of reminding us that when we're speaking, we are speaking from that land, whether we are a guest on that country or whether we are ourselves representative of that community. So let's just honour that land as we begin this conversation. We've already got a few people replying, and that's very lovely to see. So, hello, David, also a Wurundjeri country. So we're going to kind of just give a bit of a yarn. I'm not actually like doing formal chairing. I'm just going first. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about my own work, and then we're kind of just going to go through the speakers, and then we're going to come back and do something more along the lines of reading. If you could put questions in the chat at around about 3 Aotearoa time, 1 o'clock Australian Eastern Standard Time, which is where Jeanine and I are operating on, and 12:30 Central Time, which is where Nat is from, so that we can get to those. And we will try to respond to those questions as they arise. So my name is Evelyn. I am a poet, academic and editor. I am from the Bundjalung Nation of Northern New South Wales, but I was born and raised in the Darug community, and alongside family who are from Yorta Yorta, who are from Wiradjuri, and so a lot of my own cultural context and knowledge is a reflection of the broader New South Wales Kuruk community, and so I'm speaking from that knowledge basis, I'm speaking from that particular cultural context. I want to kind of begin by just making a few points and notes, observations along this theme, these ideas of First Nations negotiation of non-fiction, mostly from like a formal sense and a formal sense of non-fiction as a kind of technology of Indigenous resistance. I speak only from my own context and perspectives. I am a scholar working in Indigenous literary context, global conversations. A lot of that's been inspired by the work of Alice and many other Indigenous academics in this particular space. But my research is on Aboriginal women's literary histories and contexts of resistance and rewriting of settler coloniality. So that's the space I speak from, and I cannot necessarily claim that as representative of all other Indigenous contexts and would not seek to do so. But I think that some of the observations and comments here are relevant for these dialogues. So I just want to begin by momentarily addressing some of the formal context around Indigenous negotiations of those non-fiction boundaries and functions. Non-fiction is, I think, definitionally constituted by what it is not. It is not considered imaginary. It is not considered ficto. And although increasingly less so, I think we've seen a lot of movement and tension here. It is often not considered creative. So when we're talking about non-fiction, obviously, these categories are blown up extensively, and they can refer to any and all kind of writing that is not explicitly within the constraints of the novel. I've been doing a bit of research around the idea of the novel as a Western technology, but particularly focusing on Aboriginal use and movement around the novel since the post-Mabo era in Australia, as a technology of Indigenous resistance, of Aboriginal resistance and rewriting of space. So I don't necessarily hold fast to any of these definitions. I think as Indigenous people, we can take what we want and we can do what we want to do with it, and we do that in an incredibly interesting way. But when we are thinking about nonfiction with its implication of truth-telling, of a kind of reality, we have to understand that a Western concept of that is endorsed in certain secular notions of reality that are not necessarily reflective of Indigenous cultural contexts and community truths. So when we talk about truth-telling in an Indigenous context, particularly thinking about Australia, we have associations and connotations arising around national inquiries and commissions, investigations into injustice and mistreatment of Aboriginal people, of First Nations people on this land. And those associations are often deeply traumatic. And I think if we place that kind of emphasis on truth-telling in a context of nonfiction, we actually lose a lot of the possibility and space and experimentation that's reflective of First Nations negotiations of that in an Australian context. So I wanted to just give a quote from Edouard Glissant, the Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean scholar, in a chapter called Right to Opacity that he wrote in 1990. And he's speaking here of his writings of the West and criticism that he receives when speaking of the West so much in his own work. He says, "And what would you rather I talk about at the beginning, if not this transparency whose aim was to reduce us? Because if I don't begin there, you will see me consumed with the sullen jabber of childish refusal, compulsive and powerless. This is where I start. As for my identity, I'll take care of that myself." And that particular phrase, that particular emphasis on that aspect of his life, his experience, his writing being a matter for his own concern and his own capacity to take care of, I think that's the place that I really want to centre in this discussion that we're having around the negotiation of what nonfiction is and is not. Because ultimately, as Indigenous peoples who have had our own truths taken away from us and reconstituted, translated through legal contexts, and now increasingly we're kind of contending with these very literary and media-driven legacies of what, you know, these untruths about us and the impact that they have. I think we do have to emphasize that our definitions are something for us to consider. They might be fluid, they might be flexible, but they're ours. And I don't necessarily feel completely driven to, you know, elucidate what they are. So the kind of final note that I want to make about form here before kind of, you know, we move on to Emalani is that I don't really know what nonfiction is in an Indigenous context, and I don't particularly care. I think it's an interesting drive without necessarily concluding or creating a confinement or a space there. So I want to close with a quote from two incredible First Nations scholars from Turtle Island, Eve Tuckett Reed. This is from like a seminal document. Many of you would have read the Glossary of Haunting, and if you haven't, you need to go and read it. So this quote summarizes a lot of my own feelings and ideas around the work that I like to do around genre and form and space. So all praise to them. They write, "In telling you all of this in this way, I am resigning myself and you to the idea that parts of my telling are confounding. I care about you understanding, but I care more about concealing parts of myself from you. I don't trust you very much. You are not always aware of how you can be dangerous to me, and this makes me dangerous to you. I am using my arm to determine the length of the gaze. At the same time that I tell, I wonder about the different endings, the unfurled characters, the lies that didn't make it to the page, the anti-heroes who do not get the shine of my attention. Each of the entries in this glossary is part of the telling. Together they are the tarot, turn this one first, and one divination, turn another first, and another divination. Yes, I am telling you a story, but you may be reading another one." Beautiful.
Beautiful. Thank you, Evelyn. Aloha mai kako o wau o Emalani case no Hawaii mai au. Ina e ke noho nei wau ma ka aina o Te Whanganui Atara. My name is Emalani Case. I'm a Kanaka Maoli from Hawaii, Hawaiian from Hawaii, but I currently live and work on the lands of Tiatiawa. Shout out to Alice, whose whenua I'm currently on in Te Whanganui Atara, otherwise known as Wellington, here in Aotearoa. Thank you for opening up the conversation. I've been reflecting on things you've said about, you know, what what is nonfiction. It's often defined as what it isn't, but we get to define what it is. And I've also just looking at, thinking about our panel today, I've been reflecting a lot on my models of great nonfiction writers, and many of them come from the archives. And so I'm going to be talking a bit about the Hawaiian language archives, which is where I do most of my archival work, and actually where I found most of the inspiration from my own writing today. So if you're not familiar with the Hawaiian language archives, they're a massive archive. In fact, they're one of the biggest, the Hawaiian language archive is one of the biggest Native and Indigenous language archives in North America and in the Pacific. It includes books, manuscripts, and thousands of pages of newspapers. And a few decades ago, we may have considered it a hidden archive, what Hawaiian historian Noelani Arista calls a hidden archive, or an archive that was hidden in plain sight. Because after the banning of our language as a medium of instruction in 1896, we saw the drastic decline of our olelo, of our language. People, a common story, people were punished for speaking it and therefore stopped speaking it, stopped passing it on to their children and grandchildren. And as a result, we lost sight of our people as writers. After the introduction of an alphabet in 1820, my people took to letters. They wanted to write. They were writing, they were sharing, they were recording their stories. One of our kings, King Kamehameha III, declared, Heau puni palapala ko'u, mine is a nation of people who palapala, who write. So they wrote between 1834 and 1948, they were writing in the newspapers, not just writing about what was happening every day, but they were debating, they were teasing one another, they were talking across newspapers. There were over 100 newspaper titles that ran during that time. And they were recording their stories. Very importantly, they were recording epic sagas that ran over the span of a few years in daily or weekly installments. They were talking about their cultural practices, they were debating genealogies, they were talking about whether, the politics of the day, and once America came in with their imperial desires, they were talking about that too. Sometimes supporting America, and that was something I had to learn in going to the newspapers, that not all of my ancestors were saying the things I want to see. And sometimes they were very resistant. But I take inspiration from them because the form was really open. They could be creative. They could write stories, they could write songs, they could write riddles, and they didn't care about any particular form of what nonfiction was. And so I draw a lot of inspiration from them. But kind of reflecting on a question that was asked in this morning's amazing keynote by Ngahuia, who are we writing for? I often think about who they were writing for, and I think they were writing for us. They were writing for generations, the generations to come, and they were also writing for place. So when I write for people, I write for community, and I write for Aina. And Aina in Hawaii is the word for land, but it's also the word that means that which feeds. So it's every source of sustenance that I try to write for. And in my writing, in my work with writing of the past, that's in the Hawaiian language archives, I try to bring voices out of the past, to bring them back to people, especially those people like my own family who can't speak Hawaiian. And I try to bring it back to place. And I just want to acknowledge the privilege that I've had to learn my language at a university. I had to learn it as a second language learner. And with that comes deep responsibility, because there are so many people who will still never be able to access this archive. Even though we have more awareness about it, we've got thousands of people who know it's there, it's close to them, and they can't read it. So I thought, just to kind of talk a little bit about writing and how writing is for people and for place, I would just tell a short story about something that happened as I was working on my PhD years ago. So in 2013, I was engaged in research, and I was pulling stories from the newspapers, from Hawaiian language newspapers, and I found a mele, or a song, or maybe it found me, I'm not sure. But it was written and published in a newspaper in 1893. And if you know anything about Hawaiian history, 1893 is the year that our Queen Liliuokalani, was overthrown by a group of greedy American businessmen who staged a coup and took over and imprisoned her in her home. And 2 months after that happened, a friend of the Queen, a woman named Evelyn Kalani Wright Prendergast, published a song in one of the newspapers. And it was called Kalanakila o Hawaii, which means the victory of Hawaii. And at a time when you may have expected her to feel really down, depressed, perhaps, she wrote this song that was staunch. It was like, yes, you came over, you overthrew my friend, the queen, but we are here. And she said in the mele, there's no one from outside of Hawaii who will shake us. Because we are rooted, we are grounded, we are steadfast, and we are protected here in the Piko o Wakea. And the Piko o Wakea you can interpret in various ways. One, it's the name for the equator, so that raises questions of being grounded in a very fluid space. But also, very poetically, the Piko is our word for belly button, but it's also the word for summit, like the summit of a mountain. So I interpret it to be the summit of Mauna Wakea, Wakea being our sky father, who in union with Papahana Moku gave birth to our islands. So it's about reconnecting to genealogy, but also going to the top of Mauna Wakea, the mountain that is the child of our sky father, Wakea, which is Mauna Kea, the mountain on my island. So it's about rooting in land, it's about rooting in place. And after I had started writing about this mele in this chant or this song in my PhD thesis, I realized I started to hum it, like hum a tune to it, even though I didn't know how it went. And it reminded me of something Noelani Arista says in her work on the archives. She says, we don't just we can't be eyewitnessing, we have to be ear witnessing. We have to be listening to the archives, because so much of what is written is meant to be said, meant to be sung, meant to be chanted, meant to be danced. And unconsciously, I just started humming it. And after submitting my PhD, I ended up going home to Hawaii, and my cousin took me up to that mountain, Mauna Kea, and I went to the Piko, I went to the summit, and she took me to an altar, an ahu built of stones, and she said, lay your prayers down. And I did, and Mauna Kea, if you're not familiar with issues in Hawaii, is at the center of a long-standing, ongoing battle and debate about astronomy and culture and indigenous rights. We've been in a long, ongoing battle to protect our mountain from desecration. So she took me there to lay my prayers down, and I offered that chant or that song and sang that composer's words. And I didn't do it saying, this is what we need to do with the archives, this is what we need to do with our writing. But upon reflection, years later, I realized, I think that is what we need to do with our writing. Yes, it's committed to the page, but so much of what we write as Indigenous people is meant to be shared, meant to be spoken, meant to be sung, danced, breathed, given space. So that was a turning moment for me. And when I really started to think about what I write now, and my hope is that it will be spoken about or talked about or maybe sung and chanted in some creative, performative way, because that's who we are as storytellers. And I'll just end by saying, when our queen was imprisoned and overthrown in 1893, her people sent her flowers. And of course, they were symbols of love, but very importantly, those flowers were wrapped in newspapers. They were wrapped in writing. They were wrapped in the nonfiction of our people who are saying, we still want to talk to you and communicate with you and tell you what's happening in our community. So it was the words that really mattered around those flowers. And my hope for my own writing is that they'll be like that newspaper text wrapped around flowers. So I'll end there. Mahalo. And I'll hand it to Alice.
Kia ora, Emalani. He mei tēnei ki a koe e hoa. He uri tēnei o te atiawa me taranaki. It is my privilege and pleasure to be on this panel. We all wish we were together. I've had the good opportunity to spend time with everyone else on this panel in various random places at different points. So it's really nice to have this little online reunion and to get to talk about these things that matter to us. I do also want to acknowledge Tina Makiriti in particular has been very proactive about ensuring that there's really good Indigenous presence and participation at this conference. And that kind of proactivity is actually the thing that makes a difference, and also that makes this feel like an opportunity and not a chore. So I did want to acknowledge Tina And if anyone's out there running a conference and wondering why Indigenous people aren't coming, you might want to go have a talk to Tina, because she can give you some good tips. So I'm in Kirikiriroa at the moment in Waikato, sitting here in my office at the University of Waikato. And if we had been meeting in person, as Emalani mentioned, we actually would have been meeting in my place. My co-panelist from Australia, might think of it as my country. It's my whenua, is Wellington. So we're doing this strange thing, and Evelyn kind of referenced it as well. We do this strange thing in the online environment with grappling with how many whenua all of our feet are respectively on, how many different countries, and it's really good to be inclusive rather than exclusive about that, or rather than forgetful. And this idea of invitation and who's hosting and who's guesting for me connects with the kōrero in our panel. Because although the conference would have been meeting on my place, actually the panel was conceived originally by our amazing 3 Aboriginal scholars based in Australia. And so although I would have been in some ways hosting, I am also very mindful of being a guest in this panel. And this is the complex and exciting opportunity that we find ourselves in always as Indigenous scholars, simultaneously hosting and guesting. And in some ways, my thinking about this brings to mind some writing from Ujuru Nunako, who back in 1973 was writing under the name Kath Walker. And she wrote an essay which was published in New Dawn, a dodgy little publication put out by the New South Wales government for the edification or what have you of Aboriginal people under their care. And there was a special issue that came out of that publication in 73, where a whole bunch of essays were published that had been presented as verbal talks at the first meeting of the Aboriginal Arts Board in Canberra. And her article was about Aboriginal literature. And she, of course, is a very famous person, poet, writer, activist, amazing person. But one of the things that I love about her essay is that she talks about all these different writers who are Indigenous to Australia. And then near the end of her kōrero, her talk, which, of course, I have engaged with only as a written piece, although also I've had a chance to have a little peek through her archives and also see the rough copies and drafts in Queensland. And she says, it would also be to our benefit to meet with and know writers of New Zealand and the Pacific and of other lands where the indigene has made his or her way into the field of literature. And I wanted to share that that moment from 1973, because that's my ticket into this panel that I'm holding on to humbly and respectfully to the women who conceived of this panel, to say thank you for inviting us into this conversation. And in fact, the idea that Indigenous people would be interested in talking with one another, and that there would be some benefit to meet with and know each other, is something that Indigenous writers from all of our respective lands have been thinking about for actually a long time, and longer than I think we want to give them often credit for. How did I end up reading this essay? Because I was reading the parallel dodgy publication put out by the New Zealand government, Te Ao Hou, the New World, that the New Zealand government put out for Māori people to bring us into modernity from the early 50s to the mid 70s. And then I realised there was this kind of parallel publication coming out of New South Wales. And so, like so many Indigenous projects, it started with reading about my own. And then in Te Ao Hou, there were all of these Indigenous writers who are writing about other Indigenous people, all these Māori writers writing about other Indigenous people. And then, of course, I go over and read New Dawn, and here's this Aboriginal woman going, in this moment of declaring a thing around Aboriginal literature, I'm going to acknowledge these other Indigenous people. And so for me, in terms of this, the conversation I guess we're having as a panel, you know, when I do a lot of archival work in my research, I'm interested in literature, but I'm not really that interested in what non-Indigenous people write about Indigenous people. I'm not really that interested even in what Indigenous people write about non-Indigenous people. My interest is in what Indigenous people write about each other and the ways that we connect and sometimes disconnect in really embarrassing ways sometimes with each other. What are the moments that we talk past each other? But one of my interests is what can an archive do when what you're interested in doing is reading Indigenous people writing to Indigenous people? So I guess for me that maybe expands a little bit our thinking about some of the genres that might count as nonfiction in my reading of 20th century periodicals. Yep, sure, I've read, you know, articles written by Indigenous people and you know, things like that. Some of the books that, you know, were mentioned in the keynote this morning by Ngāhui Te Aue Kōtuku, absolutely. But our people were also writing letters to the editor of all kinds of publications. Indigenous focused publications, non-Indigenous focused publications. Our people were prolifically writing letters to the editor. In Te Ao Hau, you know, an article will be published one month, and then by the next issue, there'll be like someone like sitting in there with the letter to the editor. Oh, okay, so maybe that's how it goes in your tribe, but I have the correct version, and it's like this or whatever. So this kind of grappling, this intellectual engagement, this cultural engagement, this assumption, not just that Indigenous people write, but that Indigenous people read. And for me, that becomes an important part of the conversation. Letters to the editor, also book reviews. And so I guess I want to, I've kind of gone a little bit all over the place. With book reviews is a place where in Te Ao Hau, there's a really important Taranaki writer and thinker, Jackie Sturm, who writes all of these book reviews in like the 50s. So in 1955, she publishes a review. So this is written for Māori to read in 1955. You know, like 20 years before books started being published, because up to the New Zealand publishers are like, oh, Maoris don't read. So she's writing this thing and she's writing to other Māori, and she says, those who read can hardly imagine life without books, and those who don't read find it difficult to understand the person who can put his nose in a book and keep it there for 2 or 3 hours without dying of sheer boredom. But this doesn't mean that some people are born to be readers and some are not. Reading books is rather like eating oysters. It's an acquired taste, and you can't really say you don't like oysters until you've tried them once or twice and given your palate a chance to make up its own mind. Most of us can't afford to develop a passion for oysters in our children, but giving them the opportunity to form the reading habit is a different matter. You might counter this by saying that school gives the child a chance to become fond of books. Not always. Reading in schools is usually reading for a purpose. It's something the child is expected to learn, but not necessarily to enjoy. And then she, you know, continues through her review. Her reviews are they're incredible. She's like, wow, we're writing science fiction. She reviews books, and she also shares her theories on books all the way through. And what interests me is, how do we think about the place of the book review, produced by the Indigenous writer, to Indigenous readers, talking about Indigenous and non-Indigenous books? What's the place of that? This kind of grappling, this kind of literary critical work, but also this really interesting use of a very particular non-fiction form in, I think, Indigenous hands. So I guess for me, I wanted to, bring to our conversation today this idea of Indigenous people as readers as well as writers, and Indigenous people, what happens when we approach an archive with an assumption, not just of Indigenous presence, but of Indigenous writerly presence, and of Indigenous writerly presence, which is at times, for really important reasons, directing its attention to a state, or to colonial presence, or to non-Indigenous X, Y, or Z, but which is sometimes directing its attention to other Indigenous readers. I think it's possible for us to rethink the way we engage with archives when we look for this work. Jackie Stern was, of course, also a poet, so I thought I'd finish by reading something that she wrote about, which is a way that I think about how we can think about archives in these ways. She talks about working for the Wellington City Library. She worked as a librarian for many, many years. And when the city, some renovation work was going on, which for Wellingtonians will be a familiar topic, given some current renovation stuff in that area. And she talks about thankful that we never knew, right? So this idea of being thankful in the contemporary moment that we never knew. We didn't have to forget trees, gardens, buildings, yes, even buildings before these ones, or what the site was like and could be again. So they warn us when it was sea, all sea, and only sea. So with the ocean that's connecting us in the panel, I'll now look across the Tasman to our final two speakers. I think, Nat, you're going to be next. Kia ora.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much to Evelyn, Alice, and Emalani. Beautiful, beautiful words. Papers always deeply inspiring me. I just want to acknowledge the beautiful country that I'm on Ghana country here in South Australia. I'm right in the heart of the city at the moment in a city office in a very tall building, but right next to a very significant place, Tandanyanga, the place of the red kangaroo, in the heart of Adelaide in the city. And yeah, this country has always sustained me, Ghana country. I was born in the western suburbs. I've lived here all my life. I acknowledge my elders and all the up-and-coming leaders and our ancestors that have really shaped my thinking and my creativity and nurtured me in so many ways. I also extend my acknowledgement to all of the countries, wherever you're from, wherever you're zooming in from to listen to us have this conversation today, and to thank you also for the warmth, the very beautiful warm welcome to this panel through Evelyn and Jeanine, and also from our hosts in Aotearoa. Yeah, deep thank you. So as a Narungga woman, I identify as Narungga. I've always lived here, but I'm not Ghana. And similar to Evelyn, there's just been a lot of movement and shifting, and so I'm connected to many different countries here in South Australia. I have a 3-mission history in South Australia, which is very typical of Aboriginal families here. So we have we identify most of the Point Pearce mission station, which is on Narungga country, where my nana was born and raised. At that mission, where a lot of our family are buried, where we call home, where Nana called home. But we also have connections with other missions without all of that forced movement and removal from country and culture and dislocation through being moved to Harkin, which was known as Point Maclean Mission down at the Coorong, and also to Panindi Mission over on the west coast, north of Port Lincoln. So there's been a lot of forced movement, very typical of the families, that kind of trajectory of movement, and people were placed in these missions and reserves from all different parts of the state. So yeah, bit of connection to a bit of my family story there. I'm a poet and I'm a senior research fellow and academic at Flinders University. My research has, I've been in Aboriginal higher education since 1995. And been teaching for quite a long time, and I've just sort of been moving more into a research space, which is very much my passion and very much about the archives. So the colonial, particularly our state Aboriginal records, the state records here in South Australia, and the colonial record on our families. I was thinking about what you were saying, Alice, about the assumptions that we have when we move into the archive space. And I certainly had a lot of assumptions that we were invisible, we were very much suppressed, which we were in a lot of contexts, in a lot of ways, and predominantly really, but there is so much agency and voice and resilience and resistance and voices that we see on these records that has really drawn me in a way that I just did not anticipate or expect. So my focus of research is really looking at Aboriginal women's domestic service histories and those hidden histories and stories that are not part of the larger narrative. That's a very big introduction to me, but what I really wanted to talk about is this conversation that Jeanine and I have had over many, many years now. Jeanine and I both being poets and academics and researchers, looking at the colonial records and colonial archives and speaking back to those and reimagining those spaces through poetry. So we co-wrote a paper together called When Records Speak, We Listen, Conversations with the Archive. And we, as a way into that conversation, we wanted to consider each of us what is the archive from our own perspective. So I'm just going to read the very first section of this paper, and then I'll hand it over to Jeanine to talk about her, what an archive means to her. So, okay, so intuitively, the archive is everything. It's embodied, grounded, and everywhere like a bottomless well or a map, deep and impossible to trace. Impossible to trace toward any specific or one specific origin or life force. It is our blood memory, our corporeal connectedness, our sense of belonging, and our relationality centered through our ways of knowing, being, and doing, learned through reciprocity, obligation, shared experience, coexistence, cooperation, and social memory, and grounded in our holistic interconnectedness between and among all living things. This archive is an assemblage of feelings, objects, and stories that we gather, and all that is unknowingly gathered around us. It can be difficult to grasp or pin down, while at the same time being as constant and natural as the life-giving air that we breathe. That air that has been carried on winds with messages from generations and lifetimes ago, comprised from the concentrated elements of our ancestors' breaths that have returned for us to breathe in deep. We listen to it, we wait for it, we breathe it in. It is our re-memory, a triggering landscape that holds lessons, warnings, secrets, and signs that lure us in, trip us up, and guide all our tomorrows to come. If we open up, we can feel it beneath our feet as we tread forward, leaving traces upon traces on paths well worn. Same air, same path, different time. I recognise this non-linear temporal familiar archive as my imprinted imprint, sentimental, known, and safe. Beyond this intuitive recognition of the archive, I have an entrenched default position that is hard to shake. The archive is a dark room, a square box, a distant warehouse with a web of corridors and a revolving loading dock. It is an object, an artifact, a document, something precious. It has been stolen, collected, recorded, categorised, and contained. A fixed sacred process of consignment where provenance, objectivity, and security are assured. This archive can be violent and difficult to approach. It has a history of preservation so painstakingly maintained and a history of loss for all that it has been discarded and deemed abject, marginal, inferior, irrelevant to future memory. This is the paradox I love and hate. I've got a poetic piece to read afterwards, but it is that the paradox of the archive that's really compelled me to write poetry, to kind of, when you're feeling like you're drowning in the records where there's no other option really, to creatively transform out of those spaces through poetry, through weaving the records, through finding our voices and doing something very honouring and beautiful for the future archive and for, as Emalani was saying, so that our children and our next generations can really see our voices in the ways that we want to represent ourselves in the conversations that we're having between ourselves. Yeah, that's why I'll leave it there, Jeanine.
Yeah. Okay, Yuridu. Okay, Yuridu Maring, everyone, and thanks, Manda and Guru, to my fellow panelists who've already spoken, and in particular for Natalie, who put context on the paper that I'm also going to read from in a moment. My name's Jeanine, and I belong to the Wiradjuri people from southwestern New South Wales on the Murrumbidgee River. My grandmother was born Lil Croker in 1887. And Wiradjuri lands were the first site of colonial invasion after Sydney and the first site of big pastoral enterprises. I'm descended from the people who had a living memory of what that river was like before white people arrived. My grandmother had a grandmother who remembered the land that I was lucky enough to grow up on before the white people came. So I've got a view of archives which is not buildings. Archives are things like hills or rivers or rocks, objects. I want to acknowledge, before I just go deeper into the paper, that I'm actually speaking to you today from the lands of the Ngunnawal peoples, who are also I'm also related to through connections to country. Normally I live and work on the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples of Naarm, Melbourne. So I'm a poet and an essayist and a novelist and a teacher. And for me, the whole thing is about fiction, nonfiction is a fraught minefield. In a country or in any kind of settler colony, to speak of fiction and nonfiction is already fraught. We begin living in this legal fiction of terra nullius, and then it goes on from there. I mentioned a grandmother who was later institutionalized because she was pregnant out of wedlock due to sexual assault. I had that happen to an auntie who was a daughter of hers. When they were in institutions, those handwritten records didn't end up in any kind of official archive after they left. They end up with the women themselves. And as a kid, I wonder why they keep these violent documents, which I'm not supposed to see. And in this essay this conversation that I had with Natalie, I'm not going to read the story, but I tell a story about my cousin and I finding a box where we first hear words like register of births, deaths, and marriages, but we also hear other words like carnal knowledge, quadroon, ward of the state, illegitimate, destitute, rape, octoroon, asylum. So is the archive, when I read the records of women, these women from different archives, not just the official state archives, I'm wondering what's the fiction and what's the nonfiction. Is the archive really nonfiction? This has created some very dangerous fictitious representations, and representation is my other area of interest, the power and the legacy of representation and the violent representations that are in the archive. So I wrote, these places they call archives, they did my head in for years. What are these buildings, these structures, these bricks and mortar gods that hold and withhold, include and exclude, create false images and doppelganger ghosts that haunt the soul of the self they were stolen from? Archives are elusive yet everywhere. They are everywhere in their surveillance of Aboriginal people. They are the state record offices, the departments, the colonial courts. They are the cops, the police stations. They are the schools. They are the hospitals. They are the employers. They are the public amenities buildings. They are your neighbours who have an eye for otherness and a taste for this long-running colonial tradition in this country of surveillance of Aboriginal people, or the idea that Aboriginality is everybody's business. You can ask any settler on the street in Australia and they'll be an expert on blackfellas because it's everyone's business. And so at the same time, these archives are both direct and elusive in what they take. They take notes, they take files, they take photos, they take medical reports, they take legal reports. What do they say? Where do they go? Who reads them? Who keeps them? For how long? Where do you find these interventions of the fragmented other selves, or the selves and the loved ones that someone else has made and filed and owned and controlled? And how do we remember? And the way I always write remember is in 2 words, because it's like, and because the archives have dismembered so much of a story, of a person, or of a family. So how do we remember that, like put that back together again? And so I wrote, and I have a longer poetic piece to share with you later as well. But I tell a story of my cousin and I finding a box where women keep secret documents of violent things that have happened to them, because they're their lives. They're other ghosts of other selves that are locked away. And, you know, I say I have to go back to these documents, the violent words I found in the boxes of my grandmother and my auntie's lives, confront the ghosts. My grandmother passed away without ever talking about what I found in the box in the back of her closet. My aunties were old women and I had children of my own before they ever broached the subject of those other selves, the hideous ghosts of the state-managed archives that kept them awake at night. When I was a child, I always noticed that the aunties that raised me were insomniacs. And they said they were up waiting for the ghosts. These women, my blood, have lived different lives as sisters, daughters, mothers, aunties, grandmothers, friends, lovers, and they are stalked yet by that slither of the other self, that piece of their lives that someone else stole, and that shadow that has always left them in the half light. And I also talk, I'll finish with this before we go back to a bit more of a discussion. My 21-year-old son once, when he was researching, found a 94-year-old document that had been missing for years. That was the missing piece in a sexual assault case relating to my aunt who had passed away without this. My 21-year-old son found this and in an archive. And I felt like I was about 58 at the time, 58 years shifting. But you never want to start there because you weren't there. I want to start, nearly a century later, which is here, where the ghosts still stalk me and where the words in the box come back. And backtrack with the archive from there, which is arguably the archive in that broader sense of the word and all those things I said. The archive is probably, but that official archive is arguably probably the biggest institution of fiction that we might have. So I might leave that there for me. And
thank you. I think the next set of things we're going to do is we're going to keep going back around in the circle. Thank you so much, Jeanine, and also thank you, Alice and Natalie and Emalani, for all of that, because it's amazing and startling and dazzling. We kind of loosely planned to just do sort of readings from this point on, and I wanted to just read like a short excerpt of a poem / appendix that I wrote in my book Drop Bear, which is basically a big archival study and response and repudiation of particular tropes in the structuring of Aboriginality in Australian children, particularly children's literature, but also just national culture. And I read this in a context of nonfiction because in the same way that Eve Tuck and Siri created a glossary for a non-existent host document, I wanted to use that structure to create kind of a fictional appendices of the entirety of Australian literature so that I could avoid the complexity of actually having to, well, not avoid the complexity, but avoid actually having to speak directly to those texts in an organised and coherent way. So an appendix appearing without a specific object was my attempt to provide my own kind of safety to make these criticisms without it necessarily being read as a direct response to settler colonial textuality and the challenges that I would then be entangled in as a result to that. So this is called Appendix Australis, and I'm just going to read like a short kind of section from it. 28. From Tuck Yang, decolonization is not a metaphor. From Tuck Re, yes, I am telling you a story, but you may be reading another one. 29. Quod Vede, she doesn't speak for that river. 30. In reference to Poetry Reading Sydney 2018, your body is not the ghost gun, your fingers not sea reeds, your eyes not shining like the brush tail curled against the tree. Your body is invasive, and these are not your relations to claim. 31. Reference belonging to Matthews, Mann, Barker, Sims, Nips. Do not disturb the journey. Do not pass without greeting. Do not forget who made this place. 32. McCann. Here, modernity demands human sacrifice. The spectre will be romantic, noble, a metropolis built on bones. 33. Wybelina. Good health. Go to hell. 34. Dear sir or madam, no, I cannot advise on your A, poem/play/novel/monograph, B, tattoo, C, family story, D, plans to most woefully distribute a fraction of inheritance from your slave-owning/mine-owning/land-owning ancestors. 35. The term necropastoral has been borrowed by ecopoetics before completion of the service it owes to the people who were buried on the land, not those who stole it. 36. D, I am reckoning with my willingness to let the earth take back its generosity. 37. Sick, not a fucking ghost gun, ibid. 38. Regarding who told you you could speak for my totem. 39. In demonstration of the necessity of entertainment for the pretty white children, which erases the ugly black children so they might forever know their place is nowhere. Demonstration of nostalgia as a compulsive return to a site of longing and trauma as a condition of inheritance. 40. Don't say reconciliation action plan, say fuck the police. 41. Take me back to anti, so I might rest in the soil and never have to read a poem again. 42. In reference to the original question, does the land actually want you? 43. I would like to respect and honour and remember the ancestors who spilled white blood for this place. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Evelyn. So many lines in that. I'm flipping on to. I've decided to read a poem, and the reason I chose this poem is because when I was speaking earlier, I talked about going home to my mountain and laying my prayers down into or onto an ahu, an altar. And that altar had been built by contemporary kia'i or protectors of our mountain. And a few years later, it was taken down and dismantled by the state. And their justification was that it wasn't traditional or customary because it wasn't old. And it was basically just saying we don't have the opportunity to create in the now as contemporary Kanaka, as contemporary Hawaiians. So I wrote this poem for that ahu, and also for a hale or a thatched house that was also dismantled on that same day. And it's the poem that starts my book, and the poem that I took the title of the poem to be the title of my book that was published earlier this year. So this is called Everything Ancient Was Once New. And it was written, I think, in the spirit of the composer whose work I drew on from the newspapers. I think it was written to both get myself in and out of pain. because I mourned the loss of those structures that morning and felt the need to write something to restore my hope, even through the devastation. So I'll read this poem. Everything ancient was once new, a new altar built stone by stone, each one chosen, collected, each one passed hand by hand, stacked together to bear the weight of prayers, thousands and thousands of prayers. Sweat from palms seeped into pores of stones, carrying the salt of our bodies, our tears, to a time we haven't arrived at yet, a time we are now preparing for, dreaming into existence with radical hope, with cries and calls for aloha aina. New altars should be allowed to wear age in weathered grooves, in ho'okupu, in stories created and kept safe in pockets, like dried ocean turned to salt, carrying the promise of the sea and our inability to be stagnant. Everything ancient was once new, a new hale built post by post, each one positioned upright, grounded in mountain soils, standing to shoulder the weight of the nation, thousands and thousands sheltered. Each lashing drew together strands like genealogies, twisting, forming, growing, and birthing new kia'i for a time we haven't arrived at yet, a time we build pebble by pebble, facing the future with our backs. New shelters should be allowed to wear age in dried leaves and weathered woods, in songs and chants sung, lashed together like aloha aina linked in arms to guard mountains, standing with generations forward and back, and our refusal to remain idle. Last night our new was denied ancientness. Our descendants denied the right to collect our prayers from altars, to find shelter for awakening, to find salt for healing kept safe for them in grooves. Last night our new was denied ancientness, dismantled in the dark, destroyed, an altar taken apart stone by stone, a hale disassembled lashing by lashing, post pulled up from the earth in fear of our ferocious love of place. Everything ancient was once new. Our structures were denied age, but no amount of dismantling, disassembling, desecrating, or disrespecting of our right to be can deny us our ancientness, our ability to stand with thousands and thousands. There can be no taking apart of this mo'oku auhau, no separating us from the kupuna we carry in our bones, in our skin, in the salt we cry. You can take an altar, pull up the posts of a hale. You can even do it in the dark, hiding. But as long as we are here, you cannot deny us and our right to time. Thank you.
Oh, kia ora. Because I don't want to participate in the invisibilization of Indigenous women in my life, I would like to mention that Dr. Jess Pasisi is behind me. She's crept into the office to enjoy this session. She's a postdoctoral researcher. She's Niuean and is doing incredibly amazing things. Her PhD was on Niue women and climate change, and she's now shooting daggers into my back for bringing her to attention, but I thought it would be very strange if I didn't. You're like, oh, random person in the room. Thank you so much for the poetry, Evelyn and Emalani. I have actually changed my mind about what I was going to read, sort of moved by the conversation of the kind of first round. So I thought I was going to read a poem, but I've decided instead to read a little short extract from a strange little book I wrote called 250 Ways to Start an Essay About Captain Cook. So this is number 34. Just to acknowledge the hard work and the hard work that all of you are doing to create space. One of the projects of Indigenous people is to push back against colonial narratives. This is the bit I describe to my students as walking into a room on the TV show Hoarders, getting a broom and a rubbish bag, climbing over all the junk until you get to the center and making a space that reveals some of the floor underneath. If you started at the door and tried to work your way in, you'd get discouraged by the sheer size of the job. This is probably how people end up on hoarders in the first place. It's not that they trash their room in one day, and it's not that they can't see there's a problem. They just get tired when they stand at the doorway and start timidly picking through things. So tired they can't tell the difference between rubbish and keepsakes anymore. So overwhelmed they confuse tiredness with sentimentality. But when you clamber over the junk to the centre, you can see how much of it can be discarded. And when you see the floor again, for the first time in years maybe, you feel a bit emotional. You see a glimpse of the floor and you suddenly remember how the room used to be, but also how it could be. You suddenly realize with a shock that when you see the floor, you shift your focus on the junk piled on top of it. You used to see a room full of hard work. Now you see an alternative future. You could live in this room again. Nat, I think it's you.
I love that book, Alice. I bought many and I've given many away. I love it. It's so good. So I'm going to read from Archival Poetics. So I was really interested in the affect of the archive, of going in there. I've written a lot about that. As Aboriginal people, going into sites that we have to actually enter those very sites to gain records about our families, that we have to enter the sites that perpetuated the violence against us. And that's a really interesting space to find yourself in. And even though they're not necessarily those same institutions as they were many years ago, they still very much are. So the affect of those spaces has really, I guess, been the compelling of the creativity. So what I wanted to do when I wrote poetry was for the reader to have that same kind of feel and experience of the archive. So when I wrote Archival Poetics, I put it in 3 little files in a little slipcase, so that the reader had to actually pull it out of the box and, oh, there it is. Pull it out of the box and have that same kind of tactile engagement and the affect of reading something and then reading the voice of the state and, you know, choosing quotes for a very particular effect for the reader as well. So once you unread some of the really awful language of the state, you can't unread it. So you can't unsee it. So then what is the responsibility that you have to that information, and what are you going to do with it, and what is the transformative act that you as a reader or a viewer have when you actually engage with these records in that kind of way. So when I read them, I felt that responsibility acutely, not only for the women mostly who I was researching, but not only for the women in my family who were being recorded in particular ways, but also for the future generations who are going to reread us in different ways. So I'm going to read. So in these 3 little books, and I'm reading from Colonial Archive, that's Archival Poetics Volume 1. It's kind of dotted with a few memory stories throughout it. So this is Memory Lesson 3, Afloat in the Wake. Navigate this wretched ocean, Board of Anthropological Research Expedition reports, South Australian Museum data card files and collections, State Aboriginal Record files, Aborigines Protection Board files, Children's Welfare Board files, and be transported with family at the hands of scientists being measured, bled, photographed, labelled, objects of fascination standing before inspectors, state ladies, probation officers, police constables, anthropologists being charged, file noted, watched, shamed in the great Australian assimilation experiment. Navigate back through the wake, seek lighthouses, stay afloat and keep watch. Try not to drown as you consider, when they come to claim me, name me, frame me, will they slice me in half or quarters or 1/16? It is possible to stay afloat with others who tread carefully through the archive and memory with dignity and purpose, who refuse to be fixed in time and biologically determined, who bear witness to colonising practices of dispersal and erasure, who re-signify the colonial archive for a broader Indigenous cultural memory for hopeful and just futures. I am here now, washing, ironing, mopping, with my nana singing Rod Stewart's Do You Think I'm Sexy? And I'm here now, walking around Point Pearce Mission Station, singing Patsy Cline's Crazy, remembering the cottage she grew up in, the hall her beloved grandfather built, the church and school she attended, the beaches she fished from, the cemetery she mourned in. I lean into her soft body as she speaks, deep love, admiration for her mother, brothers, sisters, cousins, grandparents, a whole community of aunties and uncles who sustain her with a lifetime and lifetimes of strength and stories and memories, so much remembering to fill our hearts. All this remembering compels me to write. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I see this work that I write in poetry as extrasensory. I've been challenged before about writing poetry and people saying it's fiction because I'm writing about people who have passed, but I am writing for, I say no, I'm writing from a position of an informed imagination. I felt the feel of presences. Only white fellas think that the dead can't speak. And if that's what you think, that's your problem. But it's my empowerment to have been raised to believe otherwise. And memories transmitted not only through stories, but through ways of walking, sitting, talking, laughing, eating, drinking, thinking, holding someone, touching objects. And I came to see the brick and mortar storehouses as cardboard prisons. And I write this poetry to juxtapose the violent snippets and fragments of people's lives incarcerated within these archive cells against blood and blood memory of the lives lived outside it. And to expose and interrogate these violent fictions in the archive. And it is to confront the hideous effigies constructed by the colonial imagination that once captured us. I'm reading a brief piece from a poem called Off the Cutting Board, which says, that's my grandmother on the cutting board, prodded and poked and exposed and invaded and being measured and studied by your yardsticks. And this is me now, off the cutting board, and you under the microscope. The difference is I'm remembering, putting back together what you sought to dismember. And briefly, from a piece called Cardboard Incarceration, this cardboard prison they call an archive is cold, airless, and silent as death. Floor-to-ceiling boxes contain voices no longer heard, yet wailing within, and faces no longer seen, still missing in a jail of captured snippets, images, and memories among the severed heads and bleached bones of dismembered bodies tucked tidily away in the vaults and museums and universities of the world in the name of science or history or anthropology or something else trendy at the time, justifying the collection of bits and pieces of the other. So we are the inmates incarcerated within the cardboard cells, where every neatly dotted I and symmetrically crossed T screams out, read this black angst against these white pages. Thank you. If you've got any questions now, the chat is open for about 6 or 7 minutes.
I think the chat's just full of love and lovely messages at the moment, which is good.
Which is nice.
While people are coming up with questions, I'd be really curious, Jeanine and Natalie, like what the process was around for the co-written piece, how you actually composed that, given that you've been working across different states.
Natalie, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Well, we've known each other for a very long time, and I guess we were invited to do a co-written paper. I think who was invited? I think you were probably invited first, Jeanine, and then we probably suggested a co-written paper. And I think reading each other's work very closely. So I'd done a review, talking about Alice's reviews of Jeanine's work, and absolutely loved her book that was published by Corr Press. It was just...
Oh, that was the one I did from. I'll put it in the chat. We keep talking. Yeah.
It's a gorgeous book. So, having a close read of Jeanine's work and just following her work as a fellow poet and part of my community of poets, who I've long admired, it just felt like a really good fit to really delve into theorising our work a bit more and having that conversation a bit similar to what Alice led with the biography, the special issue Indigenous Conversations in Biography back in 2016, I think it was, Alice, 2015, 2016. And that was, for me, a groundbreaking way to write academically, was having this conversational style where we cut out the colonial filter and we're actually just writing for each other. And I felt like when we were writing for each other and really interrogating each other's experiences which were very similar. So we're talking about different places, different archives, different stories, but so much synergy in our work that it just felt like a really good fit around our theorising. Jeanine had read my papers around, blood memory going into the archive as well. So we were kind of riffing off each other in different ways in different places, and it felt like a really nice fit to just come together and make it conversational and treat it like that Indigenous biography, the Indigenous Conversations and Biography project that was led by Alice and Daniel Heath Justice, and somebody else. I'm sorry, I've forgotten, but I don't mean to forget. But it was just such a beautiful project to be able to respond poetically and through our own affect and emotion and connect on a very on a different way that's not academic, but writing in a very academic, rigid, like raw Routledge. It's a Routledge paper space. Yep. So to also break that mold of what are the standards of academic writing and how do we want to do it differently, and they accepted it, so we were happy.
Yeah, and it was also kind of like about who leads what. I mean, there is this irony in Australia, and I didn't get to talk about it a lot, but I wrote an essay in the Sydney Review of Books on nonfiction in Australia. It is a way of leading. Like, on the one hand, there is this crying out where people ironically say, how do we relate to First Nations writing? How do we understand it? How can we better read it? Yet, on the other hand, they're reticent to kind of allow First Nations conversations or people to lead the way in terms of literary analysis, or slow to get the point that post-Enlightenment Northern Hemisphere post-Enlightenment Western literary analysis is not appropriate for looking at a lot of our work. So that was also part of my, wanting so much, and along with all the things that Natalie said about how much synergies there was between the work and the experiences that we had and the intergenerational experiences we have. It was also very much about, well, who should be leading this? Like, don't tell me that you want me to do something and then tell me how to do it. Yeah, that happens a lot in publishing. And I guess the other point I wanted to make is this is a contentious point, but it's very arguable that in Australia, the fiction scene is so controlled by the largely white publishing industry, with the exception of the wonderful Magabala Books, which is our only Indigenous First Nations publishing house. The rest of the fiction industry is a cog in the colonial wheel that is looking for a particular type of First Nations story. And so I was looking for avenues to break free from that. The way that First Nations fiction, and Daniel Heath Justice has written really beautifully about this, how everybody's out there wanting to get that trauma story or that deficit story from First Nations people, or that story about how sad we all are or broken we all are. But and publishers love that too. So I was looking for avenues, and I think that I want to shout out to First Nations people in Turtle Island for being a little bit ahead of in that way in terms of what's happening over there. Transatlantic creative nonfiction is really moving, or as Tommy Pico said, First Nations Turtle Island writer Tommy Pico said, this might be the space where we can be Indigenous without having our indigeneity prescribed. Yes. So that's also, part of my motivation for working within this space.
And before I sign off, I'll just also add that it was very much about love and repatriating love back to those ancestors that we were writing about. So very much loving them and their experiences, but also that love between writers and women and poets, and, just that relationality that we have with each other through that love of words, love of our stories, and just a deep respect. So I just wanted to extend that to you as well.
And I just also wanted to add to that too, and Natalie and I had thought about, and I think we put it in this essay, extending, women are the great gatherers in First Nations communities, and that crosses over into the literary sphere very much. And I wanted to also extend that role, but I was also thinking about Audre Lorde, who said, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And my auntie used to say that as well. But she used to also follow it up by saying, but you can take those tools and run away with them and build a better house. And why would you want to stay in that house anyway? Get out and build yourself a better house. And it was about that as well. It was about, First Nations tools, First Nations agency, First Nations empowerment in that space, as well as the extending love and respect, which is also extremely important. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I think because we're at 19 minutes past now, we probably need to jump off. And thank you for all of the beautiful comments that are coming in there. We didn't really have like a formal sharing structure in this. So I think we're all kind of just having a nice yarn with each other. So I feel really awkward just being like, okay, one of us is going to have to pull the plug. So I'm sorry to be the plug puller. But that is a beautiful conversation. I'm so honoured to be in the space, even a digital space, to be able to share these discussions with all of you incredible women. And thank you to Nonfiction Now Conference and for making all of this happen. And thank you for those who are listening. It's been lovely to share space.
And thanks to our moderator, our techo, Jared, as well. Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to the audience. Thank you.
Beautiful. Everyone take care and be safe. Bye.
Bye.